Judge Wesley Gaines had spent years upholding justice, balancing the scales of the law. But he never thought he would find himself on the other side of the line he had always defended. The long day in court was finally over. Wesley loosened his tie and leaned back in the leather seat of his Mercedes. He exhaled slowly. Today's corporate fraud trial had drained him, but it was a job he believed in. Justice wasn't always easy, but it was the reason he got up every morning. Birmingham, Alabama, was quiet at night. The amber glow of streetlights stretched shadows across the sidewalk. Wesley's fingers tapped a soft rhythm on the steering wheel as he waited for the stoplight. The brief peace was broken by the flashing red and blue lights that filled his rearview mirror. He frowned. He wasn't speeding. He didn't run a red light. There was no indication he was doing anything wrong. So what was going on? Wesley's heart rate increased as he slowly pulled the wheel to the side of the road. His breathing deepened. He had seen too many situations like this on the bench, but now he was the one in the driver's seat. Rule number 1, stay calm. Rule number 2, keep your hands on the wheel, where they can see it. A sharp knock on the window. Wesley turned and came face to face with a woman in a police uniform. The badge on her chest read, Doyle. Her blonde hair was pulled back tightly, taut against the skin of her face. Her eyes were cold. License and registration. Her voice was dry, no greeting, no explanation. Wesley nodded, moving slowly. He opened the glove compartment, took out the papers, and handed them to her. But instead of examining them, Officer Doyle just glanced at them and focused his gaze on him. She took in his face, the expensive suit, the fancy watch. "Is this your car?" she asked, her voice suspicious. Wesley felt a wave of anger rise in his chest, but he kept it in check. He had learned to control his emotions in the courtroom, and now, more than ever, it was needed. "Yes. Is there a problem, officer?" Doyle took a step back, folding his arms. "Mind telling me where you got it?" A chill ran down Wesley's spine. He realized the issue wasn't the traffic violation, not the license plate, but him, a black man driving a luxury car in this city. He'd been on the bench long enough to know what he was dealing with. He just didn't think he'd be the victim of it. His fingers curled on the wheel. Wesley had heard this too many times. "It's mine," he said, his voice calm, but there was something in his eyes that was a burning fire. "It's even registered to me." Officer Doyle was like an ice statue, her voice as calm as the air on a winter night. "I have a possible stolen vehicle here. Requesting backup." Wesley looked at her, a bored and hurt glint in his eyes. A simple statement, said with some kind of pretense. As if it were true. As if he hadn't just been unjustly accused. Officer Doyle said carefully, "If you look at the registration, I'll confirm it when I get back up here." She cut him off, stepping out of the car. He hadn't moved. He wouldn't be breaking news again. He would not become another statistic. Another man forced to prove he belonged. But before he could say another word, a second headlight illuminated the scene. Backup arrived. The patrol car stopped a few feet from Wesley's Mercedes. The lights swept across the road, casting long shadows. Doyle stood straight, with the seriousness of someone starting a fight. Officer Patrick Harris stepped out, a middle-aged man with eyes that lit up with dangerous excitement. "Possible stolen vehicle situation," Doyle said quickly. Harris looked at Wesley, not at the car. His eyes narrowed, his hand hovering near his holster. It had never been about the car. "Sir, step forward," Doyle repeated, his voice soft and ominous, his hand moving closer to the weapon. Wesley took a slow breath, digging his nails into his palm. "Officer," I complied. "You have my ID, my registration. If you check the system, you will see that this car is legally mine." Doyle's lips pressed into a thin line. She had no interest in checking anything. And Wesley knew, in this moment, that this story was not over. Step out of the car. Wesley had spent decades in the courtroom, dissecting bad traffic stops, exposing racism, and passing judgments that held officers accountable. But now, he wasn't just watching from afar. He was living it, every moment, every pounding in his chest. But he wasn't a fool as he reached for the doorknob. He moved deliberately slow, keeping his other hand clear on the wheel, each movement calculated, a dance of survival he'd seen too many times. The moment he stepped out, Doyle grabbed his wrist, squeezing. For a split second, she realized the warmth of his skin beneath her fingertips, a flash of humanity in the midst of the tension. A dry laugh almost escaped his lips. Turn around. He wasn't under arrest. No crime had been committed. He straightened his back, his gaze steady. I am Judge Wesley Gaines. I am not resisting. I am asking, for what reason are you detaining me? Doyle's jaw clenched. She hadn't expected it. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't shaking. He had a calm, innate authority. It made her uncomfortable. She pushed back. Because I said so. She held Wesley tight, her eyes locked with his. Part of her wanted to see a sign of fear, of submission. But there was none. He had spent his life mastering control. Emotion had no place in a courtroom. He had dealt with facts with reason, with the law. But at this moment, reason wouldn't save him. Doyle could feel the tension in his muscles. And she hated it. Hated that she was the one who had put him in this position. But she didn't let go. Harris took a step forward, his fingers twitching near his waist. Judgment or not, you're not getting special treatment. Wesley's breathing slowed. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for basic human decency. Doyle's radio crackled. An update. She was startled. What could she say? There was no justification. No stolen car. Just her assumption. But admitting her mistake wasn't easy. She leaned down, looking back at Wesley. Then, she reached behind him. Wesley's pulse pounded in his ears. Things were escalating. And just as he thought it couldn't get any worse, another car pulled up. Sergeant Luis Ramirez stepped out, his boots clicking purposefully on the pavement. A middle-aged man, gray hair, the hard face of someone who had seen it all. Unlike Doyle and Harris, he wasn't in a hurry. He scanned the entire situation before speaking. And Doyle, for the first time tonight, realized she had a decision to make. A decision that would define who she really was. Ramirez stood still, but there was a quiet turmoil inside him. His sharp eyes moved between Wesley, oddly calm, Doyle, tense to the point of rigidity, and Harris, his fingers tingling near his belt. What was going on here? A fundamental mistake? Or a mistake waiting to explode? What's going on here? Ramirez's voice was even but heavy, a voice that brooked no beating around the bush. Doyle straightened, her hand hovering unconsciously near her gun holster. Possibly stolen. She spoke quickly, as if to regain control of the situation. Driver refused to comply. Ramirez didn't respond immediately. Instead, his brow furrowed, as if he were trying to piece together the missing pieces. Driver? He repeated, slowly, tasting the word. Then his eyes fell on the identification card Doyle still held. A long moment passed. And then, a subtle but definite change. He blinked, realization dawning on his face. Ramirez's jaw tightened, his eyes briefly meeting Wesley's before returning to Doyle. This man is Judge Wesley Gaines. Ramirez's voice wasn't loud, but it had a weight that made Doyle shiver. Harris hesitated, doubt flickering in his eyes, but Doyle held her position, as if she were trying to cling to the last shred of control. Ramirez recognized it, the stubbornness, the refusal to admit wrongdoing. But it didn't change the truth. He shook his head, deliberately, slowly. No. Then, he turned fully toward Wesley, his voice softening slightly. Judge Gaines, are you okay? Wesley exhaled in a controlled breath, but Ramirez could see his patience was nearly exhausted. Sergeant, I followed every order. I produced my license and registration. Your officer refused to check it and instead called for backup, escalating a situation that should never have happened. Ramirez felt a simmering anger rise. His nostrils flared as he turned to Doyle, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable command. Did you run his license plate? Doyle hesitated. And that was all the confirmation Ramirez needed. He snatched the registration from her hand, pulling out his radio. This is Ramirez. Run the license plate on a black Mercedes. The response came immediately. There was no theft report. The car was registered to Wesley Gaines. A tense silence fell. Ramirez turned back to Doyle. This time, there was no mercy in his voice. You had this information in your hands. And you continue to escalate. Do you realize what you just did? Wesley's voice was low, but it cut through the night like a knife. Doyle's lips pressed into a thin line. I was just being cautious, she murmured. No. You weren't, Ramirez shot back. You were reckless. But Doyle wasn't ready to give up. She'd gone too far to admit she was wrong. That didn't mean the judge wasn't acting suspiciously. He's acting suspiciously, she muttered, her eyes still distant. Wesley stared at her, suspicion clear in his eyes. He exhaled slowly, fingers curling into his palms, clenching his waning patience. Ramirez turned to look at him. His face was heavy with something close to regret. I'm sorry for this, Judge Gaines, he said, his voice soft. This should never have happened. But the damage was done. And Doyle, she still refused to admit her mistake. Which meant the question remained, would she actually face the consequences, or would the system protect itself once again? Wesley stood there, jaw clenched. His heart was steady but heavy. He had spent years upholding the law, believing in the integrity of the system. But now he stood on the other side of it, humiliated, the accused on trial. Sergeant Ramirez had made her position clear, Doyle was wrong. But she wouldn't let go. I was just doing my job, Doyle insisted, folding her arms. Her voice had lost its edge, but her pride wouldn't let her back down completely. How was I supposed to know who he was? Ramirez stared at her. You don't need to know who he was. You just need to do your job. But Doyle still wouldn't look at Wesley. She never did. Wesley breathed through his nose, mustering every ounce of patience he had left. Officer Doyle, I want to hear it from you, he said, his voice low, weighing each word. Do you believe you have good cause to pull me over? No doubt. Good cause. Doyle's throat moved as if she wanted to say something, but nothing came. Because there was nothing to say. The only reason she stopped him was because, in her mind, a black man in an expensive car didn't belong there. Ramirez stood there, her eyes never leaving Wesley. The weight of the truth was pressing down on her, pouring into every breath, every beat of her chest. She knew it. Wesley knew it. But neither of them broke the silence first. Ramirez took a deep breath, then exhaled, as if trying to release some of the pressure that was gnawing at her. She shook her head, turned to look at Wesley, and said, her voice soft but firm. Judge Gaines, you are free to go. A bitter laugh escaped Wesley's throat. Free to go. As if he were truly being held, as if he had done something wrong to deserve being held. His years on the bench had shown him many situations like this, but for the first time, he was on the other side. He reached for the car door. A simple act. An easy way out. But something inside him resisted. Something screaming. He had spent decades in courtrooms, seen lives crushed by the system he had once believed in. How many times had he seen cops abuse their power? How many times had he heard the platitudes of those who used their badges to justify their wrongdoing? But when it happened to him, what stopped him from turning away? Just walking away, letting it become another statistic. And then what? The next person Doyle pulled over. And the next. And the next. No. He turned. Ramirez blinked, partly surprised, but she said nothing. No, Wesley said, his voice low but clear. I will not let this go. Ramirez's breath hitched. So did Doyle's. I will file a formal complaint, Wesley continued. Officer Doyle abused his authority tonight, and I want it on record. The world seemed to stand still for a moment. Doyle whipped her head toward him, her cheeks flushed, a reaction somewhere between anger and confusion. You can't be serious. Wesley tilted his head, his smile devoid of humor. I'm a judge. When I say something, I mean it. Ramirez nodded, slowly but firmly. That's your right. Then he turned to Doyle. And you'll have to answer for it. For the first time, Doyle looked worried. She'd always been protected, always had someone to protect her, always had a way around it. But would it be this time? That was the real question. And Wesley didn't leave without an answer. Doyle's expression hardened. But there was something behind her eyes, uncertainty, maybe even fear. She was used to getting out of situations like this easily, a simple excuse, a quick dismissal, a slap on the wrist at most. But not this time. Ramirez pulled out his notebook, his jaw tightening. Officer Doyle, I need you to explain why you stopped me. Doyle blinked. Her shoulders straightened. She was no longer the one asking the questions. She was the one answering. I told you about the suspicious activity. Ramirez's eyes narrowed, and Wesley saw something cross her features. A flicker of hesitation. Only for a second, but in that moment he saw it all, the calculation, the struggle for justification, the quiet panic with no apparent cause. Ramirez replied, her voice firm. No. Doyle clenched her hands into fists. That's ridiculous, she muttered, her breath coming in short gasps. We really let people like him intimidate us? We stay silent. The words echoed in Wesley's head. People like him. The words carried more weight than anything else in the room. Ramirez took a slow step forward, her eyes flashing dangerously. Say that again, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Doyle pursed his lips, determined but also aware of the line she had crossed. The air was tense, as if one more word would shatter everything. Wesley sighed. There was no remorse in their eyes. No remorse, no acknowledgement that they had been wrong. Just regret at having been caught. Ramirez turned, her eyes meeting Wesley's. I'll make sure this is documented, sir. Wesley nodded, slowly. But it wasn't enough. I'd like to speak to your captain as well, he said, his voice sharp. Tonight. Doyle's eyes widened a little. A flash of panic crossed his face. Ramirez didn't object as she reached for the intercom, her voice steady but strained. Connect me to Captain Emerson. We have an emergency. There was a long pause. Then the voice came over the intercom, copy. Connect now. Doyle clenched her jaw. Her chest heaved, her breathing quickened. Her facade of calm finally cracked. Are you really doing this? She snapped at Wesley, her voice a mixture of anger and fear. He remained calm. His eyes held hers, steady and unwavering. Because if he didn't do this, who would? And this time, just this time, the system had to answer for itself. But the real test wasn't just what had happened tonight. It was what would come next. The ride home wasn't the same. The roads were the same, the city lights still flashed across the windshield, but Wesley wasn't the man he had been just a few hours ago. He had believed in justice. In the law. Into the notion that if you follow the rules, the system will work the way it's supposed to. But tonight proved otherwise. Doyle pulled over, the engine still running, but he didn't turn it off. He sat there, in silence, letting the anger and frustration seep through his breath. His hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white from the force of his grip. The feeling was familiar, but it was sharper this time, heavier. Because this time, his name was on the complaint. The weight of it all weighed on his shoulders. All his years of trying to maintain his dignity in the system seemed to only highlight the harsh truth. Even as a judge, he couldn't escape what was deeply ingrained in this society. He'd seen it too many times, the excuses, the light punishments bestowed on those who should be held accountable, while others were crushed for their smallest mistakes. But this time was different. This time, Doyle would face real consequences, or she, the cop who had stopped him, would be transferred to another precinct, given sensitivity training, and then continue her unbridled power trips. He knew the script. He'd seen it play out hundreds of times. But this time, he couldn't let it end like this. And what if he wasn't a judge? What if he was just a regular black man, walking home from work, with no title to protect him? Would he be arrested? Thrown to the ground? Or worse? The thought made his chest tighten, his breathing heavier. Stories like this weren't just hypothetical, they had happened, were still happening, to people without a Sergeant Ramirez to intervene, without the privilege of leaving with their dignity intact. Doyle thought of her, the cop who had stopped him, of the arrogance in her voice, the way she had defied, refused to admit her mistake. But it wasn't just her. It was a system, a culture that was sustained by tolerance and lack of accountability. That only changed when pressure was applied. And that was exactly what he intended to do tomorrow. He wouldn't just file a complaint. He would push. He would demand transparency. Consequences. Change. Because if even a judge could be treated like this, what did it mean for everyone else? Those without a judge's robe to protect them? He sighed, shook his head, but there was no resignation in his eyes. This fight wasn't over. It had just begun. And this time, he wasn't standing just as someone who carried out justice according to the law. He was standing as a man demanding justice. If you believe in accountability. If you believe this story matters. Speak up. Share this. Because change only happens when we refuse to be silent.